So far in our study of evolution, we've looked at natural selection and how organisms can change over time. And if they change so greatly that they can no longer reproduce with what used to be members of their own species, they can become their own species. And so we've talked about a lot about how life can change, living organisms can change. But in order for natural selection to occur, there has to be life. So, where did that come from? So, this is going to be a very basic overview of what is thought as to the origin of life. So, several billion years ago, we know that the first living cells appeared on Earth. So, how did they get here? Where did they come from? How did they come to be? There are many theories, and unfortunately, modern experiments can never establish with certainty what did or did not happen billions of years ago. So, one theory is primary abiogenesis, and this is the theory that life evolved here on Earth from inorganic matter. So, on prebiotic Earth, there were high temperatures, there was high UV light levels, there was a reducing atmosphere, so there was no oxygen, and there were frequent lightning storms. So although these conditions are extremely harsh, they're actually ideal for triggering chemical reactions and the formation of complex organic molecules. So we've talked about this experiment before, but in 1953, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey set up an experiment to simulate what was thought to be the conditions in Earth's early atmosphere. There's water vapor, methane, hydrogen, and ammonia. And they used a high voltage electrical source to simulate lightning to send sparks through that gas. And what they discovered is that eventually, over time, chemical reactions occurred within that chamber and they produced several of the building blocks of life, including 15 different amino acids. And amino acids are what make up proteins. So Miller and Urey's experiments suggest that organic compounds may have been synthesized by chemical reactions on the surface of the Earth that was experiencing those harsh conditions. It is also thought that organic compounds could have spontaneously formed in hydrothermal vents deep in the oceans, where there are very unusual chemical conditions. Another theory is that organic material came from outer space, and this theory is called Panspermia. We do know that 4 billion years ago there was a heavy bombardment of Earth by meteorites, and this could have brought the first organic compounds to Earth. And there have been experiments that have simulated the conditions in interstellar dust clouds, and they've demonstrated that simple compounds could form into hundreds of complex organic molecules and self-assemble into cell-like structures. So, however we got the organic compounds, once they were present, then the evolution of a cell could begin. Right? So we're at this point, well, okay, we've got some organic compounds. That's still a long way from a functioning cell. So there are a lot of different steps that would have to happen. But I'm not going to go through all of them. So the main thing, or not necessarily the main thing, but one of the things is that the building blocks of cell membranes, which are phospholipids, have this property of being able to spontaneously assemble into small sacs. And those small sacs are called liposomes. And so phospholipids are a lipid, so just like oil, right? So you notice when you like pour oil in water, it balls up, right? So that's just their natural, they want to ball up because they want to get away from the water. And so that's what the phospholipids are doing essentially, is part of them doesn't like water, so they're trying to protect that. So if that small sac had surrounded a droplet that contained organic material, this could have formed the first prokaryotic cell, which is called a protobiont. Okay, so you've got the membrane, and it's thought that the organic material that got contained in the protobiome is RNA. And so once that happened, natural selection now could have begun to operate on these primitive cells. Right? So if one of them had a certain sequence of RNA that allowed it to do something that was favorable, then it would have been able to propagate, and natural selection has started now to act. And so this would have led eventually, and we're talking millions of years, to the production of a functioning prokaryotic cell. So we know that prokaryotes were the first organisms on Earth to use photosynthesis to make organic compounds. And then when they started to use water as a source of hydrogen in photosynthesis, oxygen started to be released as a waste product into the atmosphere. And then the concentrations of oxygen built up over about 100 million years. And then this allowed other prokaryotic organisms to begin to use aerobic cellular respiration. So now we've got prokaryotes that can do photosynthesis, and now we're getting prokaryotes that can do cellular respiration. But we've studied prokaryotic cells, and we know that they're a lot simpler than eukaryotic cells and the cells that make up mammals and plants and all of the life that we see around us. So how did that happen? So one of the key differences between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells is that the eukaryotic cells contain organelles, right? So specifically two that we're going to kind of focus on are the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. So scientists believe that mitochondria and chloroplasts evolved when a smaller prokaryotic cell was taken into a larger prokaryotic cell. And instead of that smaller cell being digested, the cells were kept alive and continued to carry out aerobic respiration and photosynthesis. So the mitochondria was continuing to do aerobic respiration, the chloroplast was continuing to do photosynthesis. So this is called the endosymbiotic theory. So that's represented in this image. Right? So we start with a primitive prokaryotic host cell, and then a small, in this case, aerobic bacteria gets taken in, right? So it can do cellular respiration, and it stays in there. The cell doesn't digest it because it actually finds that it's useful because it can get energy. So over time, that bacteria turns into a mitochondria. And then if that cell then takes in a photosynthetic bacteria, which can do photosynthesis within that cell, those will turn into chloroplasts. So in this way, the eukaryotic cells started to evolve by engulfing other smaller prokaryotic cells. So there's characteristics of mitochondria and chloroplasts that support this theory. So one is that they grow and divide like cells. So within a eukaryotic cell, the mitochondria and the chloroplasts actually divide on their own, just like little prokaryotic cells. Mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA separate from that in the nucleus, just like prokaryotes do. They also have their own ribosomes and make their own proteins, which prokaryotes also do. And they have double membranes, which would be what you would expect if a cell was engulfed by another cell. So they really do, when you look at them and look at what they're doing, really seem to be like little prokaryotic cells within a bigger cell. The evolution of eukaryotes from prokaryotes did not just involve the development of mitochondria and chloroplasts, obviously. Would have had to have chromosomes and a nucleus and the ability to do meiosis and sexual reproduction. So all of these things also had to evolve. And again, through natural selection, they would have slowly been selected for. But once that had happened, once we reached that point of sexual reproduction, which we know adds a lot more variety. Once that happened, evolution could take place at a much more rapid pace than before, and there would have been what has sometimes been described as an explosion of life on Earth.